Welcome to Freethinking 101, a program brought to you by the Rationalist Society of St. Louis. This is a program the likes of which you have not seen before. We will help you to examine your beliefs, your prejudices, and to sweep out some of those cobwebs in the recesses of your mind. This evening we have with us Steve Michalak, who is a trained scientist with an MS in chemistry, who is active in astronomy. He's a member of the Gateway Skeptics organization in St. Louis, which qualifies him to look at the claims of astrology. And I'm also interested in astronomy, and when my friends ask me how my hobby of astrology is coming along, I get a little perturbed. And I suspect you do too, Steve.
Exactly.
But maybe you then can start off this first half. We're going to have two programs. Start off with this first half telling us what basically is astrology.
Well, astrology is a belief that the planets, the sun and the moon, as they move across the sky, have some sort of influence or effect on our daily lives. And they can kind of control our personalities and make us who we are. The way the astrologists work is they start off with a map of the sky at the moment and place you're born. And the map we use looks something like I have here on this chart. This is called a natal chart or a horoscope. It's set up something like a clock where you have a line across the center from 9 o'clock to 3 o'clock, which represents roughly the horizon at the moment you were born. And the clock is then divided up into 12 sectors, or the astrologist calls it houses. House 1, 2, 3, and in a counterclockwise order, back around to house 12. On the outside of this clock, they position the constellations, the zodiacal constellations, as they align up at the moment that you're born. For example, in this case, Cancer was on the eastern horizon at the moment I was born. Included on the inside of the clock are positions for all the planets. This is the position of the Sun, Venus, Mercury, Moon over here, and the other planets as you go around.
This is your horoscope?
Yes. I constructed this myself following the astrologer's rules on examining horoscopes. It takes about 2 hours to construct this from scratch, and if you had a computer with everything programmed in, you could probably accomplish it in a couple of minutes. But it takes a lot of time to determine exactly where the planets are located years ago and to get them correlated to the graph. Once you have this, the easy part of astrology is done. What comes up after this is the astrologer now sits back with his books and his training and uses the art of this system to try to interpret what the meaning of the positions of all these planets are. For example, he can turn to a book and read that if Sun lies in Cancer, it'll say that this individual is this way or that way, whether he has tendencies to be more masculine or extroverted or generous. If he has Jupiter lying in Virgo, it might mean something else. He takes all these readings from all the different chapters in his astrology book and somehow puts together an interpretation of what your personality is, or what it should be. Not only does he use the position of the planets here, but he also has to be concerned with how these planets relate to each other. For example, the Moon here and Pluto here are exactly opposite of each other, and they're called in opposition. If certain things line up in opposition, these mean other things as well. If planets are lined up in like a 90-degree angle, such as possibly Mercury and Jupiter, this would be called square. And if certain things lined up square, there's other interpretations you add to your horoscope. You begin to build statements on statements and develop many different inputs as to what the personality should be like. And it's the astrologer's job to weed out the appropriate ones and somehow formulate and maybe an opinion of what your personality is like.
It's sort of like giving someone a Rorschach test, only a little bit different.
To some degree. Now, there are 10,000 astrologers in this country, practicing astrologers, And they charge somewhere between $25 to $100 to have this done. I believe late spring of last year, the Gallup Poll did a study in the United States to determine how many people in this country believe in astrology. And we found out that 25%, it's 1 in 4 today, believe that astrology does have some truth and that planets do affect your everyday life. 2 out of 4 definitely believe it has no effect, and not 1/4 are undecided. And this is an improvement over the last 4 years, where 4 years ago, almost 30% believed that astrology was true.
We're headed in the right direction.
We're getting
one would
there.
think. Very good. The horoscopes, you know, they have a lot of these in the newspapers, and I'm wondering, those seem to be rather slipshod because they don't really have the time of birth or anything like that, and I'm wondering about those.
Well, that's a good point. Most people are familiar with astrology through the horoscopes that appear in daily newspapers. And astrologers and scientists alike all agree that these are just there for entertainment purposes. There's no basis whatsoever for them being factual or, you know, can help your life. Astrologers firmly stand that if you do not have the exact time and location of your birth, you cannot possibly determine what your personality is. Most newspapers, therefore, print, as the St. Louis Post-Dispatch does, on top of their column that this is for entertainment purposes only, and there is no scientific basis there.
Yeah. Just as an aside, I understand that many newspapers have put that disclaimer in there at the instigation of an organization called the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal, and that is sort of the parent organization of Gateway Skeptics, I understand. Well, how did astrology get started? I understand it's an ancient kind of thing, and some of the scientists of past centuries were astrologers themselves, I believe. And how was it determined that planets can have some effect? I mean,
Well,
strange idea.
Astrology has evolved over the years, and it appears it got its start some 3,000 years ago, back in Babylon, which is now the area of Iraq and Iran. The people back then were wise enough to notice that when the sun appeared in certain areas of the sky, in certain constellations, that there were major changes around the Earth. For example, when the sun was in an area which we now call Cancer, you had summer. And if the sun was positioned in Aquarius or near Orion, you would have winter. They believed that there must be some force that's moving this huge body, the sun, across the sky, and that's probably also causing the seasons to change. They also knew that as the moon moved, tides were affected.
Yeah.
And if they could figure out what these forces were that were acting on the planets, making them to move, maybe they could figure out how these forces might affect everyday lives.
Sort of an early attempt at science.
To some degree, yes. In 700 AD, the Greeks picked up on this and adopted most of this attempt by the early Babylonian people. They began to add, or actually define, what the zodiacal constellations are, the ones we're aware of today, such as Gemini and Taurus and Aries. And to that, they added all the planets, and the planets came with their names, and added a little bit more interpretation as to how these affect lives. Now, in the beginning, back in this early day, astrology only was used to predict major events, such as battles, or whether a new kingdom being born would be successful or would have problems. It was never originally set up to predict any individual's life. Well, after so many years of practice, they began to predict what the king and the royal family's life were based on astrology, and up until recently, now almost all the common people and everyone has some sort of ability to look at an astrological chart and determine who they are, in fact.
Speaking of the king and the royal family, sort of reminds me of Ronald Reagan and his wife. They're not royal, but maybe some of the same things involved there. I'm not sure. Well, were astrology and astronomy always separate studies?
No. The way they evolved, astrology and astronomy were the same study in the beginning. It was developed mostly by the Arab countries, and anyone who studies astronomy today very familiar with the names of most stars and many of the constellations, stars with names such as Deneb and Aldebaran. These are Arabic names, and they're the ones who identified the sky and set things up. And that was the science, and there was no distinction between how the study of astronomy would be, the logical science, and the belief that planets affect your lives. And that continued even through some of the greatest scientists that we've had in the deep past, such as Aristotle, who was both an astronomer and an astrologer, until we get up to the time of Galileo and the scientific revolution. At this time, the scientists who were just now learning how to use science to find truth were beginning to find out that many of the ways they thought the heavens were set up were incorrect, and they were beginning to learn that things were different. And at that point, astronomy split from astrology, and they both went almost completely opposite directions.
That's when they junked the Ptolemaic system.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. I wonder, are there any, I guess we don't find very many astronomers these days that are also astrologers.
I venture very, very few.
Yeah. This whole idea of planets affecting the way people live and so on seems really quite strange to me because they're so far away. But I'm wondering if there's some kind of force in the universe that could be responsible for these effects that the astrologers claim. You know, some idea that they might have it. I don't know.
Yes. Now, the way science looks at the world and the way the astrologers look at the world are very, very different. Astrologers look at it in an old world point of view. For astrology to work, you almost still have to believe that the Earth is flat and that the Earth is steady and that everything evolves around the Earth. When Galileo and company and everyone since has showed us that the Earth does rotate and that it does revolve around the sun rather than sit still, it gives us a whole different perspective. And I think in order to get a good feel for how astrology works, or maybe how it doesn't work, I need to go into a little bit to how the solar system is really designed according to the way science sees it. If we take a look at this chart, this will give us an example proportionally of how the solar system and the universe is set up the way science has identified it. In this chart, we list all the heavenly bodies and give them a relative size. So if the sun would appear about the size of a baseball, the planet Mercury would be no larger than a period in a standard newspaper print. And that period would rotate around that baseball about 4 yards out. Venus would be roughly the size, the head of a pin, 7 yards away. Earth, the planet we all live on, would be another pinhead about 10 yards away from that sun. And all the other planets, etc., Jupiter and Saturn are only the size of a pea, but look how far Saturn would be from the sun, 95 yards, a full football field away from that baseball. Neptune, Pluto, the furthest, is 4 football fields away. When you consider these large astronomical distances, the closest star we have to our own star, the sun, would be located, not down the block or a mile away, but somewhere out near Omaha, about 500 miles.
In this scale here. Right. And I see you're shrinking the universe 10 billion times.
Yes. Most stars you see at night when you look up are somewhere on the order of 7,000 to 200,000 miles away on this scale. So there's still an enormous distance. And these stars range in size from pinheads to beach balls.
Yeah. Now this is just in our galaxy, right?
These are just the stars that you can see in our galaxy out on any night. There are many stars much further away that you cannot detect. Now these stars, the distance from 7,000 miles to roughly 200,000 miles is approximately the distance from the outer diameter of the Earth to the orbit of the Moon. So all these baseballs, so to speak, are out at that distance. Now it's important to position yourself out at that distance, somewhere out near the Moon's orbit maybe, looking back toward the Earth, which is a pinhead. Now if you imagine yourself to be an astronaut on the Moon, looking back to Earth, and imagine me sitting here holding the pinhead up, which represents the Earth.
That's on this scale.
On this scale. The force that astrologers believe controlling our lives somehow acts on this pinhead. And the position of this pinhead, as it just sits and rotates, forms all the houses. So the exact position this pinhead is, as it rotates in a one daily pattern, can completely change your personality. So it's very critical that the forces can detect exactly the position of this pinhead as it rotates around. Now, the astrologers believed that the Earth stayed steady, and there must have been huge forces to move these spheres about, which were probably half a mile up in the sky, just couldn't reach them. And if that's the case, if all these items are that close being moved by a force, well, that force might be close enough to affect you. But when you think that just the way this pinhead is rotating, some force way out thousands of miles away is going to affect the eastern side one way and the western side another way, which is essentially like maybe the second house and the seventh house. For that force to make that distinction, that resolution, that boggles the mind.
Yeah.
But they
And
still
that's
believe
just
that's
on
there.
this model. If you multiply that by 10 billion, that gives you the real distances that are in effect.
Yes. Now, in addition to that, there are some other problems that arise between astrologers and astronomers. Being an astronomer, when I look at the date I was born, being July 8th, I know that the sun was not in Cancer, as the astrologers have told me. They say that anyone born in July 8th is right in the middle of being a Cancer. But the sun's not there. And I've always wondered why that is the case. And this is also rather important. I got another chart to explain some of this inconsistency. On this chart, we can graph the year starting from the beginning of January all the way through December and correlate that to what sign you are according to the astrologers. They would say something like, from those born between March 20th and April 20th, that you would be in Aries, this constellation here. And if those people who are born, like myself, between June 22nd and July 22nd, you'd be a Cancer. In actuality, astronomy, if you look at the charts and check out the position of the sun, it's not where they claim it is at all. In my case, being July 8th, which is right about this line, I'm right smack dead in Gemini. And I don't understand that. Am I a Gemini or am I a Cancer? This is a good question I'd like to have answered. The understanding of why this is, you have to go back roughly 2,000 years to when astrology was developed, and you can begin to see where they went astray. 2,000 years ago, the sky appeared like this, so that those who were born on January 1st, who are called Sagittarians, according to the astrology 2,000 years ago, that is where the sun was.
Correct.
Today, the sun on January 1st is in Capricorn. The sun moves slowly due to a phenomenon called precession of the Earth. I don't want to get into too deep about what precession is.
It's about the Earth wobbling a little bit as it goes
the
around.
Earth spins like a top, and not only sits and spins this way, but the axis kind of rotates as it revolves.
Right.
It rotates around about 2,000 years. That's an interesting point, that they ignore that fact when they're assigning your sun sign to you. And sun sign is the particular constellation you were born under, but they do take that into account when they're determining things like the age of Aquarius and the age of Pisces, in which you're talking about how these things shift every 2,000 years. So that's just another one of the inconsistencies that come up.
Okay. Are there any other problems that science has with astronomy, or with astrology, rather?
There are quite a few. Let's consider something that, being astronomers, we understand to be inferior and superior conjunctions. When we take a look at, say, the planets Mercury and Venus, we know that these orbit around the sun. In the old days, we didn't suspect this. We thought everything revolved around the Earth. We know today, of course, they go around the sun. And if I would picture my hand here as being Earth, let's say my face is Earth, and here's the sun here, watching the sun. As I observe the sun and watch the planet Venus will move around the sun like this.
Right.
The astrologers in the old days, just saw the Venus moving back and forth. They did not realize it was actually moving
Right.
to and fro at the same time. And today they still do not consider this effect. If Venus is close to the Earth, between the Sun and the Earth, it's within just a few million miles.
Mm-hmm.
But when it comes around the back side, it's 5
Much
times
farther
further.
away, yeah.
But they consider the effect the same, that Venus still has the same force on you.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the inconsistencies. Another thing we need to talk about is forces in general. If astrology is legit, or if we are to attempt to explain astrology, there must be some sort of force or mechanism that can affect our lives.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as scientists, we know there are only 4 forces in the universe. These forces are the strong force, which is the force that produces radioactive energy. When we split the atom, it's the release of this energy that we're aware of. There is the weak nuclear force, which is difficult to explain, but it's very intimately involved in radioactive decay. These 2 forces are very narrow in range, and they only work on the inner scales of atoms, and they do not reach much of a distance. So we can ignore those forces that have anything to do with astrology because of their limited range. But there are 2 other forces which we're much more experienced with, which have an infinite range, and these are light, or electromagnetic radiation, and gravity.
Mm-hmm.
The Earth pulls on the moon, the Earth pulls on everything, and everything pulls on the Earth. That's a very long distance away that this force acts. Light spans the whole universe. You shine a flashlight, and eventually it'll make its way to Alpha Centauri and all the stars beyond. There's no problem. Light and gravity do affect over long distances. So these would be the only 2 choices we'd have in examining what effect forces have on us.
Right.
Now, the astrologers tell us that at the moment you're born is when the forces first act upon you, when you're born in a hospital. It would be very difficult for light to be involved. We can almost rule this one out because the hospital lights are going to be so much brighter than the lights shining from the planets and from the sun. And if you're inside in the shadows, or you're outside in bright light, these have to make big differences. They're not compensated for. Your horoscope does not ask you whether you're in the sun or in the shade or at night. These don't count. So light is going to be ruled out because too many possible interferences there. The one thing that could be there is gravity, because gravity will permeate any body. The gravity affecting me comes through the rug on the floor and through anything else. It's totally transparent. So gravity is there, and we all know the effect of gravity in the way of tides and how the moon affects things.
Yeah. Celestial mechanics accounts for a lot of things through gravity.
So gravity is a very good possibility we have to consider.
Mm-hmm.
If we look at the effects of gravity, though, we go through the calculations that Newton has lined out, and we take a typical child being born in a hospital. We can look at how the planets affect it and how maybe the doctor and the hospital building itself might affect that child. If we consider the calculations for tidal forces, and we just scale the effect of Mars to be a scale of force 1,
Yeah.
we can see that Jupiter would be about 6 times that amount of force, Saturn about the same amount of force on us as Mars, Venus, being much closer, would have about 52 times the force of Mars, the Moon and the Sun being huge objects and much closer than those, somewhere around 500,000 to 1,000,000 times the force of Mars. But look what happens if you calculate the gravitational effects alone on the doctor and the hospital building, which are so close to you.
The doctor bending over the mother-to-be.
If you're really going to determine what your personality is based on, looking at gravity, you have to consider where the doctor is, where the hospital is, and probably where all the jumbo jets are in every airport around the world.
Mm-hmm.
So it gets quickly, when you take a look at the calculations, gravity can't be the effect either. And that doesn't leave any forces left that we're aware of.
Okay. Could there conceivably be some force that we're not aware of?
That's always possible. There always can be something that we're not aware of. Not very probable, because we would have to rewrite all of science, throw Newton and Einstein out the window, and start from scratch.
That's sort of like the idea of extrasensory perception. It would require some force that's unknown to science.
Yes.
It's a very similar kind of thing. Well, it seems like there are some problems related to that. And with all that you've discussed about these inconsistencies between science and astrology, is this enough evidence to disprove the claim of astrology?
Well, it's an important point to make here. No matter how much evidence or how much you can show that it doesn't make sense, it doesn't disprove it. A good analogy is, can I disprove the tooth fairy's existence? Well, you can sit up night after night visiting different children who put their tooth under a pillow and observe with cameras and videotape to see if the tooth fairy shows up. And every one of the experiments you do, you'll find the tooth fairy doesn't show up. But it doesn't show the tooth fairy doesn't exist. You can just show that it's not there those times.
Not coming around anyway.
However, it's pretty easy to prove that the tooth fairy does exist. If you do see one photograph of the tooth fairy, you've got it done.
Yeah.
So that's all we ask, is that the astrologers do one experiment to show it does exist, because we can do experiment after experiment, study after study, to show there is no possible effect, but it doesn't disprove the idea.
Yeah. I think that's part of the nature of science, to look at things that way, if I'm not mistaken. Have the astrologers done any research that would either prove or disprove their claims?
There are some efforts that have been done, and many of the studies, which we'll get into in the next talk, deal with this. Often enough, we find that the science that's needed to conduct these talks is missing. There are biases present. There are just outright flaws in the logic and in outright cheating in trying to prove these things. And when you examine all the evidence very critically and scientifically with proper controls, you find that out of thousands of studies done, nothing yet indicates that there's any reason to believe in astrology.
No. This is interesting. I know when I heard you before, there were some astrologers in the audience, and they did, during the question period, they did make comments and ask questions, and I remember two of the astrologers said, well, they know it works, and I don't think we pushed them on that, but they did say they knew that it works. Well, this has given us, I think, a pretty good idea of the nature of astrology as it's practiced. And we are going to have a second program, and I think we're going to be looking at some of the studies that have been made to see about the validity of astrology. So I want to thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Those of you in the audience, if you have any questions regarding astrology or the nature of it, things of that sort, if you'd like to get in touch with us, we have a phone number that you can call using the 314 area code. Our phone number is 298-6649. Or if you'd like to write to us, our box number is, for the Rationalist Society, Box 2931, the zip code is 63130. We would be pleased to hear from you, and if you have any suggestions for some of the kinds of programs you would like to hear of interest to rationalists or free thinkers, we would like to hear from you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
I bet a fly.